Thank you very much. I'm going to present the paper that I have entitled Member Apart, Bakhtin and the Notion of Dialogism. In a book from 1990 entitled Dialogism, written by Michael Holquist, the foremost English-speaking scholar of the Soviet thinker Mikhail Bakhtin, the author admits to that the term dialogism itself was never used by Bakhtin during his lifetime to describe the complex system of philosophical and literary investigations he undertook. But the notion is not Holquist and has followed Bakhtin since he was first introduced to Western readership. Tsvetan Todorov, who together with Julia Kristeva brought Bakhtin to France in the 1970s, used it as early as 1984 in a chapter title. Yet there is no doubt that Bakhtin would have rejected instinctively the notion of dialogism. The transformation of a method of dialogue into dialogism would probably have corresponded to his description of the move from Socratic dialogue to Hegelian Marxist dialectics. In one passage of his 1970-71 notebooks, he attacks dialectics as being a dialogue first robbed of its voices, its intonations, its living responses, and then crammed into one abstract consciousness. Formalization, codification of the context, was finality and death. Creating a dialectics of something equal discontinuing the dialogue with it. Dialogism could thus be understood as the sign of the dialogue that the dialogue with the dialogue had ceased. This is, of course, an exaggeration on my part, but I will try to illustrate how it's also both right and wrong, how we can save dialogism from Bakhtin himself. In his early Kantian and philosophical period, Bakhtin used the notion of the dialogue to describe the process of what we can call individuation. Even though Bakhtin later would place emphasis on language, he is here concerned with the spatial and the act of seeing. There is excess in seeing insofar as I can see the parts of the body of the other that this other cannot perceive him or herself. The same is true for all kinds of knowledge. The dialogue is a process of co-individuation in which two non-divergent horizons come together by a projection of two others into each other. We need to understand our being not as simple mirrors, but in a metastable system of individuation in which existence is constituted by an interaction between two or more parts. It is, in other words, ourselves constituted, not reflected, we experience in others. The I without the other, as a reflection, Bakhtin described as empty, ghostly, and eerie. The subject experiences through an object. It is only by experiencing through the object's love or fear that the subject can understand itself. But for the communication between two individuals to be possible, they have to enter into an ethical relationship of care, what Bakhtin called the enveloping atmosphere of deepest trust, in which the subjects invite each other to assume each other's position as a precursor to completing each other's horizons. The atmosphere for this encounter was essentially to be transitional in the sense of Donald Winnicott. In the return to itself, the subject not only avoided a pathological identification with another, for example with someone else's suffering, but it was also in this shift back that the experience of seeing through the other could be rendered, quote, ethically, cognitively, or aesthetically, end of quote. Though Bakhtin's philosophy owes a lot to Kant and is a return to Kant through a rejection of the transcendentalism of Neo-Kantianism, it can also be read, as Peter Sima has done, as a dialogue with the young Hegelians. As he attacked the notion of harmonious totality in Hegel and embraced ambivalence and openness by rejecting the notion of Aufhebung, synthesis, and with it Hegel's notions of truth. The fundamental difference between his position and that of the young Hegelians was Bakhtin's reluctance to praise the conflict between the binaries. Truth was not in conflict, but in the attempt to make binaries communicate. In other words, we can describe it as a movement towards a fruitful metastability between units such as self and other. This metastability presupposed the possibility of communication and dialogue if there If there were such a thing as dialogism, its creed would be that participants in a relationship must be answerable for their enunciations. This answerability protects the metastability of a co-individuation in which subjects discover themselves both in their uniqueness and in their organic belonging to a unity. A unity of means, as it were, as opposed to the harmonious unity of ends in Kant. The stress on answerability led Bakhtin to a rejection of the technological in favor of the organic world of the word, the enunciation that had someone behind it. In his first published essay, Art and Answerability from 1919, he claimed the existence of two different unities, one mechanical and the other the unit of answerability. In later writings, he would develop his critique of the mechanical as a space comprising of all kinds of theories and abstractions, following its own detached immanent law and not communicating with the environment. The result of this non-communication was a deeply pharmacological situation. What had been rational could become, quote, terrifying, deadly, and destructive force, end of quote, serving evil rather than good. It had, in short, become irresponsible. I suggest that to understand Bakhtin's argument, we can evoke Marcus Aurelius' reflections in his meditations over the difference between melos and meros, member and part. Rational cooperation was, according to Aurelius, possible when individuals acted as members of one body. If the act was not motivated by something else than the experienced love for one's fellow, one remained apart. The member needed to sympathize with the other members and, following Bakhtin, remain open and associated. The part tended towards disassociation through closed autonomy. It is here important to note that the binary for Bakhtin was not singularity versus unity, but answerability versus irresponsibility. His assumption was that answerability, entering the dialogue through acknowledging one's codependence, was an ethical principle leading to the good. Irresponsibility, on the other hand, could pharmacologically produce negative as well as positive outcomes, which was why it should be avoided, according to Bakhtin. This unity was alien to living historicity, as it constructed a deterministic world in which the subject was unnecessary and non-existence. As thus it could not, quote, provide any criteria for the life of practice, end quote. Detached parts could, for Bakhtin, never take the ethical space of participating or associated members. Even Kant's categorical imperative became, in Bakhtin's words, an empty demand for legality. An open-ended, radically contingent, and ambiguous answerability was equal to philosophy as a moral activity, and for Bakhtin no real philosophy existed outside of answerability. So Bakhtin would have probably rejected the term dialogism as an embodiment of abstract and theoretical consciousness, separated from historicity, from participation and plagued by an air of dogmaticism. At the same time, his philosophical writings are characterized by the same lack of answerability that they deplore. They are impersonal, technical, and seemingly existing in an ahistoric realm. Bakhtin was famously irreverent to his own text. Not only were they subject to censorship, but also to his own disregard, as exemplified by him often publishing under pseudonyms and using the paper of his book, manuscript on a German novel to roll cigarettes with during the hardships of war. His writings were championed by friends and students, thanks to whom they were republished or published in the early 1960s, leading to his later international fame, which for the most part then happened after his death in 1975. Thus, the proponent of a profoundly Socratic method also inherited Socrates' great distrust of writing in the Phaedrus, an activity he, like Bakhtin, described as a pharmacon. The Phaedrus being an inheritance, of course, they came to writing through a trans-individuation by technical means. The middle part of Bakhtin's scholarships was taken up by an engagement with literature, that is, with the pharmacon that he was so deeply ambivalent towards. He wrote 3 important works, of which 2 remains: The Study of Dostoevsky, written in the 1920s, and of Rabelais, written in the 1930s. He saw Dostoevsky as a pioneer of the new polyphonic novel that was profoundly dialogic, a word heir to the Socratic tradition that returns an open-ended unity of dialogue against the corruption, as Bakhtin argued, of Socrates by the later Plato. But there were limits to the dialogic imagination of Dostoevsky. Bakhtin had to concede that Dostoevsky only had been dialogic in his novels. As a public intellectual, he was prone to both close dogmaticism and even eschatology. In his work on Dostoevsky, Bakhtin located the origin of the Socratic dialogue in the folk carnivalistic expression. He develops these thoughts in his large thesis on Rabelais that was to be published as Rabelais and His World. The carnival was, quote, unofficial, extra-ecclesiastical, and extra-political, end of quote. A profoundly democratic rejection of official truths characterized by the negation of the actor-spectator binary. Laughter and profanity challenged the seriousness of the medieval order and subverted its rigid hierarchies. The carnival was not to be seen as a temporary suspension of normality, but rather as an eruption of a profoundly dialogic truth. It was through laughter that the medieval crowd fully realized how they were in fact organic members of a whole rather than mechanical parts of a system. This laughter was ambivalent and universal, a weapon against dogmaticism, intolerance, fanaticism, pedantry, fear, intimidation, and sentimentality. There is a complex attempt to historicize the carnival in Bakhtin's book on Rabelais. He argues that the medieval laughter was repressed by official culture, leading first to the individualization of laughter through satire in the Renaissance, and then to the romantic grotesque that finally co-opted and perverted what Bakhtin termed the realist grotesque of the medieval period. Romanticism rendered the public private, interiorized the carnival. The laughter lost its joy and became more ironic as the grotesque was rewritten as something terrifying and alien to man, as opposed to being a liberating force that emanated from the lived culture of man. The images of the carnival came to represent fear-inducing terror, madness, and vulgarity. Its paraphernalia, like the mask, stopped signifying joy of change, but came to stand for deceiving obfuscations that hid a terrible vacuum. The joyful devil became tragic, and the celebration of spring and light in the medieval carnival was in the neo-Gothicism of Romanticism supplanted by a fascination with darkness and night. The only reconciliation was by way of the transcendental. Laughter became, in other words, traumatic. But this said, Romanticism did make its own important discovery, as Bakhtin puts it, namely, quote, that of the interior subjective man with its depth, complexity, and inexhaustible resources, end of quote. And it was, we might add, the romantic grotesque that shaped the content of Dostoevsky's novel. Bakhtin became concerned, however, with preserving the folk expression of the carnival as a point zero of dialogic forms. In order to understand this, it is important to historicize Bakhtin, just as he historicized Rabelais. Bakhtin's doctoral thesis on Rabelais and the grotesque realism was a thinly disguised attack on the Soviet social realism that the somber officialdom used to co-opt folk forms and taste and to crush the space of the dialogic. The happily vulgar and obscene democratic laughter truly represented a traumatype to a prudish and, despite his protestations, hierarchical political order at the time and place of Bakhtin's writing. His personal courage in presenting his work on Rabelais and the Carnival in the 1940s at the height of Stalinism was considerable, and he was predictably denied the title of doctor and returned to provincial life in obscurity. The earlier work on Dostoevsky, in contrast, tells of slightly different preoccupation, but with the uniting theme of the inherently democratic nature of the polyphonic. What Bakhtin did with Dostoevsky, and even more with Rabelais, was to go into dialogue with writing, and in so doing he moved focus from the metaphor of sight to that of language. It is possible to argue that this represented, despite Bakhtin's own protestation, an attempt to rescue writing from formalization in order to make it instead a member of a living unity, or, in other words, a shift from writing to reading. One of the most poignant examples of Bakhtin's personal history was how he, a dissident, read Stalin's text and attempted to engage in a dialogue with them by writing between the lines, as well as lecturing on topics such as Stalin and the English bourgeoisie, and Marx and Engels on Byron. The dialogue is read before it is written, and this means that the most non-dialogic text furthest out on the negative pharmacological end can be, as it were, re-dialogized. And I would like to propose a reading of Bakhtin's dialogism as a formalization of this principle. And in order to do this reading, it's important to try to understand the relationship between monologism and the topic of anamnesis, transindividuation, and the trauma type that we have discussed in our seminar the past year. The monologic was for Bakhtin a part as opposed to a member. It was dogmatic, non-ambivalent, and irresponsible. The end of dialogue that had its purest theoretical articulation in philosophical idealism, in which co-individuation took on the guise of the hierarchical relationship between master and student. In the monologue, the metastable relationships between subject and object was always replaced by hierarchical ones, in which the subject was disassociated and, we might say, proletarianized. It follows from this why dialogical speech could be favored over writing, polyphonic fiction over monophonic theory. Bakhtin was at the same time conscious of the fact that it was the large historical trajectory that gave access to the associated environment in which the dialogic could be understood. In his 1970-71 notebooks, Bakhtin suggested concepts that could be seen as equivalent to the long and short circuits of anamnesis. He called these the large versus the small experience. The large experience was absolutely large, encompassing thousands of years of agglomerated human heritage. The small experience was shaped by the symbols of official culture. They were pragmatic, utilitarian, and mechanical. The large focused on epochal shifts, and the small on current stability. Memory did not know the boundaries of the large experience. It even stretched back to the pre-individual world of matter and inorganic forms. It was not a simple remembrance, but a rotating body of recollections that gave life to dialogic forms as opposed to the small experience that enclosed, limited, and objectified the subject. As we have seen with the example of Rabelais, it was, however, via the small memory and the monologism of Soviet dogmatism that Bakhtin accessed a more profound structure of historic and dialogic knowledge. It is when he forgets his historical contingency and ahistorically praised an idealist notion of folk wisdom that his argument in terms becomes most monologic and limited. The dialogism of Bakhtin works as a procedural method for rendering the monologic dialogic, and in so doing performing a long circuit of thought beyond the specificity of the period in which it is enunciated, and also beyond the stupidity of the monologue. It is a historicity of method leading to results that are always possible to historicize within that complex rotating body of memory that constitute the anamnesis. The absence of a theorization of this process in Bakhtin opens the door to invoke the shift from co-individuation to transindividuation that we also have discussed in our seminars. A shift that could be argued to entail, beyond the universalization Also that the parts become members and the irresponsible is brought to the level of answerability. Bakhtin's co-individuation as creating an environment of care for the subjects to constitute themselves in each other does, however, give a powerful image for how transindividuation, also via technical means, can lead to a positive as opposed to negative pharmacological outcome. Dialogism is an important part of this. Dialogism as an important part in this individuation entailed, for example, an explicit mention of care and love, and an implicit emphasis on non-violence. In understanding dialogism as a positive theorization and universalization, it follows that it as a principle encourages dialogue not only with the monologic of the surface, but also with the traumatypic manifestations pertaining to the process of individuations, repressions, and denial. In the Soviet Union of the 1940s, the notion of laughter was highly traumatypic. It was both a diabolic historical recurrence that the mainstream wanted to forget, but also a synchronic symbol of the socially repressed that was foreclosed. The brilliance of Bakhtin's reading was how he so pedagogically managed to show that laughter needed only to be traumatic for the monologic officialdom, not for the dialogic imagination. But in order to do this, he needed to return, in a long circuit, to the grotesque realism of the medieval period, bypassing the substantial changes that the notion of the carnival and laughter had undergone from the Renaissance onwards. In Bakhtin's historical scheme, the trauma type changes with time. Today we can say that there is very little repressed when it comes to laughter. The appropriation of a politics of drives by industrial culture led to the movement towards the individual hedonism of socialism in one person. The vulgar, the obscene, and the sexualized human body is ever present in the mainstream. Our culture has created its own industrial grotesque. Bakhtin had a notion that the laughter of the people could produce shame in the rulers. He ended his book on Rabelais with a Pushkin quote from Boris Godunov, 1831, where the false pretender dreams that, quote, "The people swarmed on the public square and pointed laughingly at me, and I was filled with shame and fear," end of quote. The present situation is radically different. Jacques Lacan famously noted the erosion of the capacity to feel shame in Seminar 17, and society has not become less permissive and less shameless since. Maybe it is reason itself that had become repressed in our time, public reason and civic responsibility. A current British example of profoundly dialogic acts of engaging with repressed and establishing long circuits of trans-individuation underscores this point. The so-called University for Strategic Optimism has during the last year held public lectures in banks, supermarkets, and next to riot police on the subject of neoliberalism, consumerism, and violence. This is a conscious attempt to reconquer public spaces already financed by tax money, for carrying out impromptu lectures for the public as the system of higher education is becoming more inaccessible as a result of de facto privatizations. This initiative holds on the carnivalistic and dialogic principle that all should be made members, participants, but it uses somber seriousness rather than laughter. A thoughtful and rational analysis of the current political situation in public is now potentially a transgressive act. But more importantly, it is also a re-dialogization and meta-stabilization of the very notion of carnival itself, by the way of anamnesis recalling rational critique. This open unity of parts becoming members can be taken as an image for the positively ambivalent concept of dialogism that has been used to describe the works of Mikhail Bakhtin. Thank you very much.
Puis-je demander en anglais ou en français? J'essaie le mieux d'eux. I'm interested in the notion of a dialogue in relation to the dialectic logic of, say, a thesis and an antithesis, and a third sublation to create an overall picture of reality. How far do you think, with Bakhtin's notion of dialogism, he's responding to, say, the hierarchy between the dialectic of master-slave, subject-object? How do you suppose he's replying to that, the structure of that way of thinking, with dialogism? Je ne sais pas en français. C'est une question au sujet de la dialectique et comment l'hiérarchie de la logique dialectique et la notion d'un dialectique pensée. Le maître étudiant, sujet-objet, dichotomie. Qu'est-ce que c'est dialogisme? C'est un néologisme d'un dialogue. Qu'est-ce qu'il fait en réponse de la hiérarchie de la logique dialectique? Je ne sais pas si it makes any sense at all.
Yes. No, I think Bakhtin's aversion to the dialectic is very much based on that he wanted to go beyond the hierarchical model, and so he took out by taking out the idea that there could be a synthetic final truth of the dialogic process. He wanted to go counter to the creation of hierarchy, so that to avoid dialectics, the master-slave component of Hegelian Marxist dialectics. So and that's why it's always his writings are extremely ambivalent. So he never really come to any overarching point, and that's, I think, the part where dialogism comes in as well, because it's also a desire to make a point out of Bakhtin's concept of dialogue that puts it in some kind of dialectic model. But he would have opposed that, of course. But I think that exactly for that reason that he wanted to make sure that the structure was non-hierarchical, which is also his fascination with the carnival stems in large part to this subversion of hierarchies. There was always a flip from high to low, from master to slave, but in a system that was metastable, and that could never have a final outcome where either the slave would take the place of the master, or the master would retain his position.
But to what extent do you think
To what extent do you think that dialogism as a concept is successful in flattening out the hierarchy and creating a different way of thinking? Il marche ou non?
Yeah, no, but I think that what I was trying to say is that it's nothing by itself. In a sense, Bakhtin is also a monologic formulation that needs to be dialogized by us. So it's a question of what we make of it through his writings. I mean, it's not. It doesn't have a finality of truth in and of itself, but it can only have a meaning as so far as we process it again and try to read it try to reinterpret it for our times, and also historicize the concepts that he was using.
In the end of your speech, you seem to imply that there is a historical change in respect to today, that there is a lot of permissivity, which would make the dialogism or the function of it almost useless.
No, only of a specific form of the carnivalistic, as Bakhtin saw it, not of the dialogue itself, but of the part of the carnival that is to counter officialdom with laughter. I think that since the poles have shifted today, or maybe since in recent history. But that doesn't affect the notion of dialogue in a sense. It affects how carnival could be thought of. I think that the notion of the carnival in Bakhtin that presses on the notion that should be no spectator actor division is still very important. But I think that maybe the role of laughter and hedonism, we have to rethink that today with the construction of what I would suggest to call something like an industrial grotesque. That is a culture of supposed permissiveness that reigns.
Je vais revenir sur la question de la dialectique. Mais avant, je voudrais repartir de cette discussion à un instant sur la question du grotesque industriel. La situation dans laquelle nous sommes, dans l'analyse d'Axel, de ce qu'il a appelé le grotesque industriel. Je pense que c'est une définition, une dénomination malheureusement très très précise, je crois, de ce que nous sommes en train de vivre. Qu'est-ce qui fait que le carnaval et son grotesque, traumatypique en un sens fécond, peut devenir le grotesque industriel? C'est un processus, vous l'avez dit dans la lecture, dans la conférence, de dissociation. Par rapport, nous-mêmes, quand je dis nous, je parle là aussi d'ars industrialiste, nous posons comme un fait fondamental, c'était aussi l'horizon du séminaire, je posais comme une situation, le dialogisme comme la condition même du symbolique. Et le dialogisme, c'est juste pour préciser pour les personnes qui n'ont pas participé à ce séminaire, moi je le rapporte au milieu associé de Gilbert Simondon. Et c'est un milieu associé, symbolique, voilà, milieu associé chez Gilbert Simondon, voulant dire plusieurs choses d'ailleurs, en particulier, ce qui est le plus connu, c'est la turbine électrique qui associe l'élément naturel à son fonctionnement technique, donc c'est archi connu, mais ce qui est moins connu et peut-être plus important, c'est que l'individu psychique est toujours associé à son milieu mnésique. Et qu'il est toujours, ce milieu mnésique est un quasi-milieu pré-individuel pour lui. Ce qui est très important dans la théorie ou l'histoire du carnaval chez Bakhtin, c'est que ça décrit un milieu associé qui a au moins deux composantes, il y en a beaucoup plus que cela, mais en tout cas deux composantes dont nous parlons aujourd'hui, qui sont d'une part précisément l'association qui fait que je vois en étant vu et je regarde en me donnant à voir, c'est-à-dire que mon regard se voit dans un masque, sous un masque, et évidemment dans un circuit très complexe, qui renvoie par ailleurs à moi c'est une question là que je vous pose, Axel, à un fond pré-individuel, amnésique, et ce fond pré-individuel amnésique, dans l'événement du carnaval, il s'actualise, il passe à l'acte festif, à l'acte événementiel, et il passe aussi par le rire ou toute une vie de l'esprit qui évidemment, j'aimerais bien rapporter à Freud ici. Vous avez évoqué Lacan, mais avant Lacan, je pense à Freud. Donc j'ai deux questions ici. C'est qu'est-ce qu'on pourrait dire c'est peut-être pas pour répondre aujourd'hui, mais qu'est-ce qu'on pourrait dire du rapport entre Bakhtin et le concept de pré-individuel chez Simondon? Et la deuxième question, c'est est-ce qu'il y a chez Bakhtin une théorie des traumatypes? Les traumatypes, c'est un terme qu'on a utilisé dans le séminaire, qui d'ailleurs s'oppose au concept de stéréotype, et je vais y revenir pour la question de la dialectique. Est-ce qu'il y a chez Bakhtin une sorte de théorie historique ou d'histoire je dirais, de la traumatypie du fond pré-individuel et de ses conditions d'expression? Ça, c'était la première chose dont je voulais parler, que je voulais soulever, la première question que je voulais soulever, et en ajoutant un point, par rapport à la discussion que nous avons eue hier soir sur la terrasse, et à propos des industries culturelles. Vous disiez, hier nous avons eu une discussion avec Axel, où Axel me disait que il n'y a plus de critique de la culture populaire aujourd'hui. Vous me corrigerez si je... Et que cette disparition de la critique de la culture populaire était un très grand problème. Moi je lui ai répondu, mais il n'y a plus de critique du tout, ni de la culture populaire, ni de la culture savante. Il n'y a plus de critique. Et il y a d'ailleurs eu une dénonciation de la critique par la philosophie française en particulier. À mon avis, une dénonciation irresponsable dans ses formulations. Et j'ai été très sensible. Il y a aussi des tas de questions que vous avez posées sur answerability, responsibility. Why didn't you use responsibility but answerability? I can understand that because it is precisely the question of dialogism. But how to translate answerability for not using responsibility? Derrière cette question, il y a la question responsabilité, confiance. Ce sera un sujet que nous allons aborder à la fin de l'année au Centre Pompidou. Nous faisons une grande rencontre sur la confiance. Je me suis dit que peut-être ça vous intéressait de venir y parler d'ailleurs. Quoi qu'il en soit, aujourd'hui, avec les industries culturelles, c'est aussi une thèse. Je ramène ici les thèses d'Ars Industrialis parce que pour moi c'est très important de resituer ces analyses dans un contexte politique contemporain, économique et politique contemporain. Nous soutenons Ars Industrialis qu'aujourd'hui il y a un réarmement critique qui s'opère, mais pas du tout par les académiques, par les intellectuels, voire même les artistes, mais plutôt par les publics. Enfin, nous pensons qu'il pourrait y avoir, à travers ce que nous appelons l'économie de la contribution, une reconstruction je ne vais pas dire un sujet critique, mais disons une puissance traumatypique discriminante qui produise de la discrimination, de l'intelligence. Donc ça, c'était aussi une question que je voulais vous poser. Qu'est-ce que vous pensez de cela, de cette... Je crois que vous évoquez à un moment donné l'interactivité. Je me souviens plus si c'est vous ou non, c'est plutôt Ricardo qui parle d'interaction, interactivity. Le dernier point sur lequel je voulais dire un mot et je m'arrête, c'était par rapport à la dialectique. Et c'est un peu une façon de répondre à Lorna ou de poursuivre sa question. Dialectique, ça a plusieurs sens. D'abord, moi je soutiens que je crois que nous sommes très d'accord là-dessus, je soutiens que ce que pratique Socrate, c'est du dialogisme, et que c'est très très proche de Bakhtin. C'est pour ça d'ailleurs, c'est à cause de ça qu'il y a cet exposé aujourd'hui, parce que nous partageons cette conviction. Je crois aussi que ce que Platon appelle dialectique n'est déjà plus le dialogisme de Socrate. Mais ça n'est pas encore la dialectique de Hegel. Et ça c'est très important, il ne faut pas faire de confusion. La dialectique platonicienne n'est pas du tout la dialectique hegelienne. Quand je dis ça, c'est pas forcément à mettre au crédit de Socrate, de Platon, c'est peut-être à mettre à son débit. C'est ni à mettre au débit ni au crédit d'ailleurs, c'est pas la même chose, ça ne veut pas dire qu'il est meilleur ou qu'il est moins bon que Hegel. Ça veut dire que c'est autre chose. Mais si j'introduis ce problème, cette problématique-là de la dialectique ici, c'est parce que pour moi ce qui est problématique dans la dialectique, de Platon, je ne parle pas encore de Hegel, c'est que la dialectique de Platon produit des formes stéréotypiques sans thématiser cette production en tant que telle. Je dis sans thématiser cette production en tant que telle, parce que produire des formes stéréotypiques, c'est nécessaire. Par exemple, pour que ce bâtiment tienne debout, il a fallu produire des formes stéréotypiques. C'est absolument fondamental. Il a fallu figer des équations que le maçon qui a construit ce bâtiment ne connaît pas. Il ne les a pas remises en question, il n'était pas inquiété par la vie de l'esprit hegelien. Et heureusement, parce que sinon le bâtiment se casserait la figure. Donc on a besoin de la stéréotypie, et c'est ça la question de la métastabilité chez Simonon. C'est-à-dire que pour qu'il y ait de la métastabilisation, il faut qu'il y ait de la stabilité. Relative, mais stabilité quand même. Et donc de la stéréotypie. La dialectique hegelienne va thématiser cela. Ça, c'est extrêmement bien expliqué au début de la phénoménologie de l'esprit. Là où, ce qu'explique Hegel dit, premièrement, nous ne sommes pas grecs, c'est fini. C'est-à-dire ce que les Grecs ont lu pour la première fois, qu'ils ont ouvert pour la première fois, pour nous, c'est du réchauffé, du bien connu, c'est de la répétition, c'est solidifié, ça c'est devenu des stéréotypes. Et il est très difficile d'arriver à oublier tout ce que nous avons appris. Pour revenir, c'est l'anamnèse, d'une certaine manière, pour revenir au caractère traumatypique de ces formes qui sont apparues alors. Si je dis cela, c'est parce qu'il faut faire attention de ne pas évacuer la dialectique trop rapidement. Bien sûr que la dialectique est problématique, je suis moi-même un combattant anti-dialectique contre le hegelianisme, la grande synthèse hegelienne, mais en même temps, si on oublie pourquoi Hegel a fait cette dialectique, alors on a tort de s'en prendre à la dialectique. Il vaudrait mieux rester hegelien. Parce qu'il vaut mieux rester hegelien que d'oublier Hegel. Les gens qui ont oublié Hegel, il y en a énormément à notre époque, ce sont des crétins. Et il est absolument essentiel de repasser par Hegel. Maintenant, moi, ce que j'interprète de votre exposé de Bakhtin, c'est qu'il s'agit de faire un pas au-delà de la dialectique hegelienne et marxienne, bien entendu. Il faudrait évidemment là aussi parler de Marx et de la dialectique matérialiste, mais ça, je ne vais pas le faire, parce que ça prendrait trop de temps. Voilà ce que je voulais dire, peut-être si vous avez envie de dire quelques mots.
Yeah, I think that Bakhtin has a huge problem in formulating the pre-individual because he's in constant dialogue with Neo-Kantianism and the idea of oneness in Neo-Kantianism. So he's always trying to avoid the issue by historicizing as much as he can. In his early and latest philosophical periods, he comes to some kind of pronouncements of the pre-individual, what that could consist of, and that even, that comprises also of the inorganic and so on. But they're fragments, nothing more. So it's very, very difficult to say when he discusses these issues like the carnival. It's always in a very strict sense of historicization. So he avoids the idea of the one, or the kind of the totality of ends, and also I think that the historicization he has it's a very optimistic historicization as well, or a very specific one where he wants to bring out the positive in the carnival. And he's not concerned in seeing the carnivals as also a space of a pharmacological space where both positive and negative things could happen. I mean, he never talks about anti-Semitism. That was a very, very big part of European carnivals, which ties into this scapegoats, that was the time when pogroms usually happened in Europe and so on. So he has this, because he uses it for a purpose to go against social realism. And I think that also the second question about the associated and disassociated environments. I think through reading Bakhtin, maybe dialogue is not the most important concept sometimes, but monologue is more important, because with a recent example of this, with the events in Norway, with the shootings that took place this summer, this person that perpetrated these acts was actually heavily engaged in a very associated way through digital means with other people, and so he was not at all a disassociated individual. On the contrary, he tried to pretend he was disassociated towards the rest of the world, so he told everyone he was playing computer games and acting as though he was disassociated, but that was just to disguise his association. But the association was with incredibly monologic forms of reason, and that's where the danger lies, in a sense, that it has to be brought back to the dialogic, but it's not. So the associated environment could be negative as well if it's monologic, and I think that's where Bakhtin could be a very important contribution. And this and on with the dialectic, it's very specific, because Bakhtin, the dialectic was obviously the slogan of the Soviet Union at the time he was writing, so it's very consciously going against that for that reason. But important there, as you said, is the notion of metastability, that would be the end, regardless of whatever movements that happened. And obviously he historicized the changes. He historicizes the dialectic unfolding of history through his book on the carnival. So he's not in any way countered against the idea of historicizations, but whenever the enunciation comes, it has to be in a dialogic form, because it's an ongoing process, so to speak. So if you arrest the development or arrest the word at a certain place, then again you fall into monologic forms of reasoning, which is what he identified in the Marxism of the Soviet Union, that it fell into this trap of becoming monologic, because it wanted all the time to arrest the development and make life correspond to a codified practice that had been agreed on beforehand. So it became, at best, a self-fulfilling prophecy, and probably a false one at that.
J'ajoute juste un mot pour la question du monologue, pas du monologisme, mais du monologue, ou plus exactement de ce qu'on a traduit, je ne connais pas le mot allemand, par le soliloque de Husserl. Parce que dans la première recherche logique, Husserl pose le problème du soliloque. Nous avons beaucoup discuté dans le séminaire de cette question. Comment est-il possible de soliloquer si l'on est fidèle à la pensée platonicienne du dialogue avec soi-même? Bon. Comment est-il possible, autrement dit, de dialoguer avec soi-même? Je signale que c'est en partant de cette question que nous sommes aussi venus à la question du monologue et du dialogisme. Ça appartient à tout cela. On y reviendra avec Joyce, peut-être, puisque Joyce est une pratique littéraire du monologisme. Enfin, du monologisme, peut-être pas, mais en tout cas du monologue. C'est peut-être plus compliqué que ça, mais en tout cas, ça s'est souvent dit comme ça. Et ce serait intéressant de croiser Bakhtin et Joyce. Vous le faites vous-même?
Oui, j'en parlerai.
D'accord. Je vais vous donner le micro parce qu'il faut que vous parliez dans le micro. Je veux juste dire, je vais vous le donner tout de suite, juste dire avant cela, si l'an prochain nous refaisons cette rencontre, je l'espère bien sûr, j'espère que nous continuerons à parler de Bakhtin et de dialogisme parce que je crois que c'est très très important. Et Svetan Todorov habite à 30 km d'ici. Donc je l'inviterai à ce moment-là pour qu'il vienne nous faire une présentation de la façon dont en France, dans les années 70, Bakhtin a été introduit par lui et Julia Kristeva. Eux, ce sont des gens des pays de l'Est, de l'Europe de l'Est, qui sont très sensibles aux formalistes russes, à toute cette tradition. Je vous laisse la parole. Adrien.
Oui. Je reparlerai ça on discutera avec Axel peut-être quand je vais parler de modèle intérieur, Stream of Consciousness chez Joyce. Là, je voulais juste rebondir sur quelque chose à partir de Joyce aussi. Joyce, qu'elle rappelait du XXe siècle. Je pense qu'il est candidat en tout cas au poste. L'autre, on en parlera peut-être aussi, c'est Artaud. Il y a tout un travail du carnavalesque chez Artaud. C'est pas si souvent dit que ça. Peut-être chez les Deleuziens, je sais pas. Oui, c'est sur la question de la culture populaire. Vous vous êtes entendu sur l'idée qu'il n'y avait pas de critique populaire. Là, je voulais juste conseiller à Axel, s'il ne le connaît pas, là encore un artiste, il est aussi candidat peut-être au meilleur artiste du moment, et très productif et un peu inégal du coup, c'est Mike Kelly sur le carnaval, qui a beaucoup travaillé sur les questions du trauma et un artiste très intello en plus sur du trauma et du carnaval à partir qui est un artiste courageux qui attaque le problème de la culture populaire, industrielle, et peut-être la question de ce que M. Stigler appellerait les programmes, les programmes scolaires, les programmes. Voilà, et je voulais juste, j'espère avoir bien compris, parce que mon anglais est mauvais. Oui, il me paraît dangereux de dire qu'il n'y a pas de. Là, je pense encore à Joyce et à Artaud, qu'il n'y a plus de traumatype à cause de ce grotesque industriel qu'il a fait, qu'il n'y a plus de traumatype du corps. Joyce, un des épisodes de Ulysse qui s'appelle Nausicaa, a attaqué l'idée du corps cosmétique. Je crois qu'il y a aujourd'hui une beauté officielle du corps cosmétique. On pourrait dire, par exemple, je pense le corps vieux aujourd'hui, tend à devenir traumatypique. Je pense qu'il ne faut pas dire une fois pour toutes, à cause de ce qu'est devenu la culture populaire, que le corps ne ressortit plus du traumatisme.
No, that's completely true. I think, but what I was trying to say was that it was the notion of permissiveness and laughter. There was the thing that I had lost is traumatic. I think the body is still potentially traumatic, obviously, but it's just in what form it presents itself. So it still retains that, no doubt about that whatsoever. But it was more on the notion of laughter that, and maybe some aspects of sexuality and so on. Maybe not the old body, but all other kinds of representations, in a sense. But no, there is definitely a huge theme of the body, and it's yeah.
Je suis désolé, on va être obligé d'arrêter parce que sinon on va dépasser l'horaire. On reviendra sur probablement cette question avec la ontologie, la question de la shame, de la honte. Parce que c'est ce que disait Axel était très lié à la question de la honte. Donc, et c'est par rapport à cette question de la honte qui nous a occupés aussi dans le séminaire qu'il disait cela.